I'm not quite sure why I said yes to this, but thank you for coming. And thank you, Fred. Just a couple of things before I get into this. One, I want to know how many people turned up for Sir Robert Menzies. Any figures available? No. The other thing is that it's unfortunately true in the eyes of many Australians that the term leading journalist is an oxymoron. Now, I need to acknowledge at the outset that any views expressed tonight that might appear to be opinion are my own and do not reflect the views of the ABC. I want to start with three random news moments that caught my eye in recent days that I think are symptomatic of a serious malaise in the state of politics and of the media at this point in time. Not just in Australia, but arguably in other notable liberal democracies as well. Just last week, I noticed a cartoon by Alan Moyer in the Sydney Morning Herald in which he portrayed Tony Abbott as a kind of Popeye figure called One Eye the Carbon Man, in which Tony Abbott is knocking the heads off a number of straw figures. One figure was labelled flood levy, another refugees, another one was broadband. There was the tax on profits straw figure and another of the Greens, all knocked over by the one-eyed carbon figure. And sprawled in the corner of this cartoon field of fallen straw figures was the one with red hair labelled Anything She Says. Clutched at the end of one brawny Popeye arm is the tin of spinach, but all you can see on the can is spin. Now, this is the cartoonist portraying Tony Abbott as the ultimate no-man, the great opposer of Australian politics, spinning his way to the highest office in the land. I'm not automatically endorsing that view, but there it is, and Moyer is not alone in his impression. At the weekend, another newspaper image caught my eye. It was a photograph of Julia Gillard at the royal wedding, and I thought, thank God she's changed that hair. But then I thought, why on earth do I care about what a political leader does with his or her hair? And I found myself musing on how the Prime Minister had allowed herself to become so trapped by the media preoccupation with her physical appearance. But the other part of the equation is this: why do so many of us also allow ourselves to be distracted by the same shallow stuff, to be led by elements of the media the way we so often are? And now to the third random observation that goes to what I'm talking about tonight. Yesterday, as I watched on 24-hour television the unfolding drama around the killing of Osama bin Laden, I noticed that the program producers were either trapped by the inflexibility of their own technology, which would be surprising, or they couldn't bring themselves to trust that even such a huge breaking story might be enough to hold audience interest on its own. The bottom third of the screen was still filled with scrawls of other news, just as it always is on 24-hour news, like the fact, as we are hearing this momentous story, that English soccer team Arsenal had beaten Manchester United. Such is the nature, in part at least, of the news world we live in today. The point of this lecture tonight is that politicians and journalists are inextricably linked, arm by arm, in a kind of necessary love-hate dance that's gone on for centuries, but that in these times seems to be moving only in one direction: down. Too often a tableau of wretched banality. In exploring this proposition, I want to give it some historical perspective, partly from my own experience as a journalist for more than 45 years, but partly further back even than that. At the same time as Wallace Wurth was serving as an ambulance bearer on the Western Front in the First World War, an American named Edward Bernays was engaged by President Woodrow Wilson to manipulate public support for US entry into the war without the public realising its strings were being pulled. While Wallace Wurth went on to make a laudable contribution to public service in Australia, emerging from World War II as the scion of public duty who had guided Australia's critical manpower allocation through the war, Edward Bernays emerged in post-war America as the father of public relations, claiming to have influenced even Goebbels with his strategies for manipulating the public mind. Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, blazed a public relations trail through the 20th century that has helped shape the field worldwide. In 1947, he wrote in a book he called The Engineering of Consent that, quote, if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, Is it not possible to control the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? He also wrote, quote, "The engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and suggest," but apparently going on the first quote without the public realising it. This was a man who in 1929 famously organised a parade of models holding cigarettes to march in New York's Easter Day parade and sold it as news. He issued a press release announcing that a group of women's rights activists would light, quote, "torches of freedom" at the march. With photographers primed at a signal from Bernays, the models lit their Lucky Strike cigarettes, and the New York Times ran it under the heading, "Group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom." In fact, it was part of a campaign by Bernays' client, the American Tobacco Company, to break down the social taboo on women smoking and dramatically increase their market. So journalists have always had some capacity to be conned by the likes of an Edward Bernays, or indeed at times to be willing partners, either in their own self-interest or out of sheer laziness. This lecture then is not another wearying and self-delusional exercise of complaint by a journalist against the dark arts of spin in the public relations industry and in politics, with the poor old journalist as a struggling white knight. But nonetheless, there are very serious issues at stake. In this day and age, the deck is well and truly stacked, unhealthily so, I believe, against journalists who do want to ply their trade the way it should be practiced. This is a time when the world of public relations and spin and marketing appears to have the means in its grasp of unparalleled, ultimately, but poorly scrutinised manipulation and impact. We're not just talking about the somewhat remote world of a Parliament House like Canberra's, where politicians and journalists dance their semi-private and sometimes highly selective dance. We're talking about the whole of society, a society substantially shaped by the post-war world of advertising and consumerism, of popular culture and Hollywood, of a communications explosion in the digital age that is moving in directions we struggle to comprehend. We live in an age that is in desperate need of enlightened leadership across society, an age of accelerated living, where, in the developed world at least, while people have the means within their grasp to live life like they never have before, they struggle to find the time or the energy or the capacity to fully understand, to pause and think about, to debate the massive change that is going on around them and where it's taking them, where it's taking their children, or in the case of my generation, their grandchildren. According to learned psychiatrists and psychologists, we are watching a generation of children suffer an epidemic of anxiety. Why? Where are the politicians and journalists leading and facilitating a debate around that question alone? There are so many issues thrown up by the times we're living in that I don't believe are adequately debated. The debate is there, but is it getting the space and the time it deserves? In my view, no, it's not. People who are time poor and preoccupied with their own struggles necessarily rely on mainstream media to find out what's going on. In today's complicated environment, if they're not being well served by that part of the media they go to, either they will not trust it or end up poorly informed or, worse, misled. There can be no doubt about the depth of cynicism the public applies to both politics and the media. And if you really have any doubt about that, answer this question. Why, given all the controversy, was there such spontaneous, worldwide support for Julian Assange when the WikiLeaks story broke and as it began to unfold and we began to comprehend the enormity of what that event may mean for us all? Because underlying it all is an innate distrust of probably all our institutions, most of our institutions certainly, and of the capacity of the media to report them properly and adequately. Let me talk about America again for a moment, because Australia's media and its politics are heavily influenced, obviously, by how things are done there. There are nearly 1,000 people in this room, I'm told. I wonder how many of you have heard the term astroturfing. A surprising number of my colleagues haven't. You'll find astroturf defined in traditional dictionaries as an artificial grass made of nylon backed with vinyl. But you'd have to plug into Wikipedia for this definition of astroturfing. Quote, a form of advocacy, often in support of a political or corporate agenda, designed to give the appearance of a grassroots movement. In other words, faking popular grassroots opinion. The practice in the corporate and political world is hardly new of astroturfing. But let's discuss for a minute the potential for astroturfing in the internet age. The British author, Guardian columnist and environmental activist George Monbiot has recently written extensively about the practice. His columns quote a variety of sources to paint a picture of some corporations via the public relations agencies using sophisticated software, quote, to drown out real people on web forums. He says, quote, the anonymity of the web gives companies and governments golden opportunities to run astroturf operations, fake grassroots campaigns that create the impression that large numbers of people are demanding or opposing particular policies. This deception is most likely to occur where the interests of companies or governments come into conflict with the interests of the public. Monbiot cites the long history of tobacco companies creating astroturf groups to fight attempts to regulate them. In fact, he documented some of that history quite dramatically in his 2006 book, Heat. Drawing on articles in New York Magazine, The New Yorker, a documentary called Astroturf Wars, made by an Australian filmmaker, Tacky Oldham, and on American bloggers, Monbiot describes the Tea Party movement as the biggest astroturf operation in history. If these various sources are correct, and at least some of what they've come up with is compelling, then a Tea Party movement that now does have strong grassroots support across significant parts of America, and that has turned American politics on its head, was substantially kick-started by fake grassroots networks with front groups for big money, anonymously fanning the flames. And for an insight into the kind of debate that's being promoted in that atmosphere, what does it say about the state of politics in a country like America, where the President is being asked seriously to produce his birth certificate? I won't elaborate on those articles or on Oldham's two related documentaries, but they're there for you to access if you want to make your own minds up. But one point that's relevant to us is this. President Obama has been a heavy target. His senior communications advisor and campaign veteran, David Axelrod, spent much of 2010 warning, as the Huffington Post, amongst others, has reported, against, quote, the rise of anonymously funded conservative non-government groups, going so far as to frame them as a threat to democracy itself. But guess what? On Sunday, Axelrod blessed the emergence of those same organisations on the Democratic side of the aisle, calling it a bitter but necessary pill to swallow for both the Democratic Party and campaign finance reformers. Axelrod said, quote, I don't think this is healthy, I don't think this is good, but it is the system we have, and you can't expect one side to operate under one set of rules and the other side to operate under another. Great. Something for us to look forward to. So much for Barack Obama's pledge when running for office that he would fundamentally change the culture that had corrupted Washington. Monbiot also airs allegations that companies now use, quote, persona management software to seriously multiply the efforts of astroturfers, giving each persona a fake background, email accounts, web pages and social media, automatically generating a potential avalanche of what looks like authentic profiles, making it hard to tell the difference between a virtual robot and a real person. Remember when Malcolm Turnbull's leadership was in trouble late in 2009, as he tried to keep his parliamentary party behind him in backing the Rudd government's climate change ETS policy? Remember the well-reported bombardment of emails from grassroots Liberals to their MPs, demanding that they abandon the support for an ETS. That flood of emails was absolutely influential in the party's decision by one vote to replace Malcolm Turnbull with Tony Abbott and change the whole dynamic of federal politics. Now, that may well have been a totally genuine grassroots response to the issue. But how do we know, in this day and age, against the backdrop of what is happening in America, whether such a bombardment is a genuine grassroots groundswell against climate change policy, or in part at least, astroturfing by outside interests with a financial stake in the outcome? I'm simply throwing that up there as an illustration of the way things might happen. How hard did journalists try to test the proposition that the emails might have been an orchestrated campaign? How many just reported it as genuine without question? As I said, it may well have been totally spontaneous, but how do we make those judgments given what is now possible on the web? I assume you're a fairly well-informed audience. You know how the political news cycle works here, much as it does in America. It emanates not just from the press gallery in Canberra, where journalists are supposed to have some sense, some knowledge based on what's going on, but also from political doorstops across the country with short, carefully crafted sound bites for radio, television and now various media online outlets, also by their nature relatively brief reports. That then feeds into the radio shock jock circuit and the 24-hour television news commentaries, which often build momentum into the next day's newspapers and so on. And often the cycle may go the other way. The totality of it all then impacts back on the politicians who respond appropriately into the next day's news cycle. The bottom line is that politics today is in a sick and sorry state, and I regret to say journalists, broadly speaking, are in no position to throw stones. More often than not in Australia, the practice of politics these days seems flat, uninspirational, banal, superficial, uniform, orchestrated, defensive, manipulative, dominated by cynicism, polls, private as well as public, and spin. The 2010 federal election campaign provided plenty of fodder for critics of both politicians and journalists. And I acknowledge absolutely, and I'm not just throwing it in there as a bit of tokenism, I acknowledge absolutely that there are many good people in representative politics today, and there are many good journalists. And there are many politicians who tread a weary path through the processes of politics and are lesser people by the time they come out the other end. But there are some who still have the fire burning in their belly and who still feel good about themselves when they finish. I hope that's not a diminishing quality. In his quarterly essay last December titled Trivial Pursuit, the respected News Limited political journalist and author George Megalogenis said he hadn't seen a campaign so awful in his 20 years of journalism. I would argue the same for my 45 years. Megalogenis, quote, "It was a flip of a coin who was more annoying, the robotic Prime Minister or the relentlessly negative opposition leader. Two amiable and intelligent politicians had frozen together. They delivered no memorable quotes, let alone policies, merely slogans that quickly became punchlines at their own expense, moving forward, and the real Julia versus stop the boats and end the waste. The election year, he said, felt like one long domestic dispute." But he doesn't let journalists off the hook either. In his new book, Sideshow, just published, the former senior Rudd Minister Lindsay Tanner says in his opening line, "The 2010 election campaign was widely derided as the worst in living memory." Would he have said that had he been contesting it and got back? But he went on to lay the blame substantially at the door of journalists. Quote, "Under siege from commercial pressure and technological innovation, the media are retreating into an entertainment frame that has little tolerance for complex social and economic issues." Well, Lindsay, I once worked for a newspaper in Sydney called The Sun, and what I was told in those days that I should be aiming for a mental age in my readers of 9 to 10. So there are some things that haven't changed, but I should tell you I resisted. The Sun doesn't exist anymore. In turn, politicians and parties are adapting their behaviour, he says, to suit the new rules of the game. This is the game set where the rules are set by the media, according to Lindsay Tanner, to such an extent that the contest of ideas is being supplanted by the contest for laughs. Tanner says that, quote, "While politicians may be the actors in the political drama, the media act as producers, directors and even scriptwriters. What is now universally derided as spin," he says, "is in fact a whole range of techniques that have evolved among politicians in response to changing media dynamics." In essence, he goes on, these techniques, though highly manipulative, he does acknowledge that what politicians are doing is manipulative, they are, he says, fundamentally inherently defensive. The more the media set out to trap politicians in order to generate entertaining content, the more politicians have to resort to dubious artifice to do their jobs. I wonder how long that will stand up to scrutiny. Sorry, Lindsay, you don't get off the hook quite that easily, even if you did jump ship in a fog of disillusionment. Yes, there is significant truth in your critique of how the media functions today, but your view of media manipulation doesn't, for instance, explain the appalling state of New South Wales Labor politics by the time the Keneally government was decimated by voters in March. It doesn't explain how federal Labor went through so many leaders through the Howard years, or why it was necessary for Kevin Rudd to be unceremoniously dumped by his own parliamentary colleagues, including almost his entire cabinet, before even his first term as Prime Minister was up. And was it media shortcomings, Lindsay, that led Kim Beazley to make that politically fatal decision to make himself and Labor a small policy target going into 2001 because he was convinced John Howard would lose the election with his introduction of the GST? I can remember just how gleeful Kim Beazley was around the beginning of that year about how easy it was going to be. He thought he was a shoo-in. And don't be conned into believing that it was just the refugee issue exploding around the Tampa story, or even September 11 that turned the election tide back to the coalition. Kim Beazley was politically crippled by then, because John Howard, wily old fox that he was, had already planted firmly in the public mind the perception that Kim Beazley was a weak leader who stood for little or nothing. It's interesting to note that where Labor had 5 leaders over 36 years from Arthur Caldwell to Paul Keating for an average of more than 7 years each, they've since had 6 leaders in 15 years for an average of 1 leader every 2.5 years. And that the Liberals went from Howard to Nelson to Turnbull to Abbott with bewildering speed. That is not just symptomatic of how the media functions. Lindsay Tanner's assertion of media blame is really a chicken and egg situation we could argue about until the cows come home, if you'll pardon the mixed metaphor. For instance, when Tanner says that the media sets out to trap politicians, it could equally be argued that a journalist often sets out to test, not necessarily trap, a politician because of the suspicion that the politician is being, quote, highly manipulative, unquote, or, quote, resorting to dubious artifice. I see parallels between the Blair School of Media Management and the Rudd School. According to Blair's own reflections on how his media strategies changed under pressure during his time in office, how he ran his 97 campaign on 1 issue a day for the media cycle. In 2005, he said in a speech just prior to retirement, we had to have 1 issue in the morning, another for the afternoon, and by the evening the agenda had already moved on. As Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd responded to an increasingly instant news environment by trying to constantly feed an insatiable beast. In the longer term, he set up a time-consuming and distracting process he could not sustain, the so-called announceables that came to obsess his office and therefore the cabinet. Now, what does it say about the leadership of Tony Blair or the leadership of Kevin Rudd that they were not able to put their stamp in any way on how they could conduct a campaign? Is it a kind of fear and a lack of self-confidence that if they don't fill the space, the other side will? Well, let the other side fill the space with banality. And if you are a real leader, then take advantage of it. That is what I would have thought real political leadership is supposed to be, at least in part, about. Megalogenes argues that the digital age allows government and opposition to become media organisations in their own right. Certainly the electronic press release is now part of modern politics, and John Howard used to have regularly produced television reports to his rural and regional constituency. Kevin Rudd, with Wayne Swan as Treasurer, tried unconvincingly to establish their own social media production house. I wouldn't recommend it. What I would like to do now is to provide a bit of perspective from my own personal history as a journalist, because my own professional narrative traverses, I would think, an extremely dramatic terrain of enormous change in the media, in politics, indeed across society. Very few, if any, eras, and I was talking with Fred Hillman about this before, he nominated Between the Wars as one of such change. But human nature never changes. And while human nature never changes, we are in an age where everything else is changing around us constantly, and while it's foolish to try and live in the past or recreate it, only a fool would ignore the lessons of history or ignore the evolutionary process that has brought us to our current state. When I began as a cadet journalist at Channel 9 in Brisbane in 1965, Bob Menzies was Prime Minister and Gough Whitlam was not far off becoming opposition leader. Decimal currency was about to be introduced. Black and white television had been broadcasting in Queensland for just 6 years. It wasn't only television that was black and white. Aborigines hadn't yet been included in the national census as citizens of Australia. The vast bulk of journalists in those days were recruited as copy boys and the occasional copy girl of around 15 or 16 years of age, some of whom became cadet journalists 2 or 3 years later. A journalist with a university degrees in those days was fairly rare. I was a late starter. At 20, I was the cadet in a newsroom of 4 reporters. I had a very short haircut, very large ears, a lot of freckles to go with the bright red hair, was as ugly as a hatful, as skinny as a rake, and certainly had no allowance to buy Xenia suits or Gucci flak jackets. But surprisingly, I still made it on air. There were no video news cameras. More than half the stories were shot without sound, and the rest with an incredibly cumbersome film camera, with huge heavy light kits that took forever to lug around and set up. Practically every cameraman I knew in those days had had at least one hernia. The second half of the news day largely made them rather grumpy too. The second half of the news day largely went uncovered unless it was a massive story, because the film had to be back on the station up at Mount Cootha for processing hours before the news bulletin. And after all that, it wasn't at all unusual for the newsreader to have to apologise for only showing half the story because the film had jammed in the projector, or the telecine chain if you want me to be technical. There were certainly no communication satellites to whiz pictures around the world within seconds. If a big international story broke in the morning, you could hear it on radio within the hour, read it in that afternoon's tabloid newspaper, but you had to wait another 2 and sometimes 3 days for the television pictures to reach Australia. That's how long it took for pictures of Kennedy's assassination in '63, or Bobby Kennedy's, or Martin Luther King's in '68 to make it on air. News footage from the Vietnam War was invariably 2 or 3 days old by the time it got to air. By the mid-1970s, news crews in Australia were using video cameras, still cumbersome. Deadlines were later, stories more flexible. And just a few years later, as the US correspondent for the 7 network in the early 80s, I was gobsmacked time and again watching the big American networks moving their massive mobile satellite dishes on huge trucks around the country to follow the big stories, covering the US invasion of the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada in 1984. I think that was when Ronald Reagan said America was back standing tall. I can remember standing at the satellite feed point in Bridgetown, Barbados, watching the first invasion pictures being beamed to a downlink in Maine on America's east coast, across to New York and up and down on the satellite onto the roof of Seven's office building in Los Angeles, up again to an international transponder across the Pacific, down again to Australia's satellite gateway on Sydney's northern beaches, across to Seven's satellite dish at Epping, and then live into living rooms around Australia on a morning news program called 11 a.m. 6 satellite hops, all within 3/4 of a second of leaving Barbados. Now that for me was an amazing moment, and to be absolutely honest, it still is. A few years ago, I bumped into Australia's first astronaut, an oceanographer named Paul Scully Powell, at a function in Canberra. I'd first met him in America in '83 or '84 when he was about to go into space, and he reminded me how we had made history, conducting the first ever news interview from Earth to space. I was at NASA's Houston Space Centre. It was just the luck of the draw, really, that I was first, because there were several other journalists queued behind me to interview other astronauts. In the intervening years, I'd become so blasé about the technology that I'd completely forgotten about it, probably because it involved no great journalistic merit on my part. It wasn't any great historic moment for me at all. It was really just a public relations exercise by NASA to boost the jaded media interest after years of space shuttle launches. But looking back now, it's certainly an interesting reminder of the flexibility and access that communications technology was beginning to deliver. By 1990, I was anchoring a new ABC TV program called Lateline, and a man in the audience named David Hill was very substantially responsible for that program coming into being. We did it from a small studio in Canberra's Parliament House, and from there I could dial up the world by satellite and link up with the best minds in science and the arts, philosophers, futurists, business gurus, even political enemies. Our very first Late Line was with two guests in Johannesburg, and it nearly crashed down around us because a white technician was so outraged that we had a black man and a white man sitting together in the South African Broadcasting Corporation TV studio that he pulled the plug on the satellite as we were about to go to air. We were told it was the first time in South Africa's television history under apartheid, a black man and a white man in the same studio, breathing the same air, actually speaking with each other face to face. The only television in South Africa then was the public broadcaster, and it didn't function in quite the same way as the ABC or the BBC. And there was no royalty to threaten us if someone dared to satirise. We had to get intervention from the International Satellite Authority to have the pictures restored. The next night we linked Moscow and Washington to live to bring two old Cold War warriors together for their own informal détente. At the time, this was remarkable television for an Australian audience. And since then, the two Gulf Wars have dramatically demonstrated the further leaps in technology driving television news and news broadly. The images of CNN correspondent Peter Arnett reporting live from a rooftop in Baghdad as American smart bombs exploded on targets around him, an eerie high-tech echo of Ed Murrow's famous Battle of Britain radio reports to America from the rooftop of BBC headquarters in London half a century before, except that Arnett was reporting live from behind enemy lines. A decade later, when coalition forces invaded Iraq in 2003, we sat in our lounge rooms and offices and newsrooms and hotel bars, watching live as tanks with TV cameras mounted on the front rolled across the desert sands towards Baghdad. You might remember Ted Koppel, one of America's most celebrated and respected news broadcasters, looking very fetching in full battle fatigues, quoting Shakespeare to unleash the dogs of war. It was all rather surreal, almost like a Hollywood production, and incredibly controlled and sanitised. The first embedded war of the television age. It looked disturbingly like war as entertainment. And when the Taliban were driven from their last stronghold, Kabul, 18 months earlier, ABC correspondents were reporting live with pictures from the hills outside Kabul by a satellite video phone that fitted neatly into a briefcase. So broadcast journalism has never been more immediate, more flexible, but is it better? To the extent that we can access and report more swiftly the big global stories whose import might otherwise take longer to filter through, like the Libyan uprising or many others of the past decade or older, like ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, or even helping thwart the communist Olgard coup in Russia in 1991 by exposing it to global pressure as it was unfolding? The answer is obviously yes. But trying to bring any kind of journalistic depth to an innately superficial medium has always been a struggle. And the advent of 24-hour television, the obsession with personality-driven journalism, the endless hunt for breathless melodrama by reporters who sometimes give the impression that their wardrobes and their performance in the often unnecessary piece to camera or live cross is at least as important as the story itself, has meant that much of today's television news is more superficial than ever. On a visit to CNN's Atlanta headquarters a decade ago, slightly over a decade ago now, I noticed a large graph on a wall under the headline, CNN's Chart of Human History. On closer inspection, it turned out to be a ratings chart. And the biggest event in human history, according to CNN, was O.J. Simpson's bizarre attempt to flee police, broadcast live from helicopters. I don't think much has changed in the CNN culture. In fact, since the advent of Fox TV in America, some would argue that CNN has moved closer to lowest common denominator television. You may have heard the punchline of the story I'm about to tell, but it's always good to have the context. One of America's more venerated broadcast journalists, Daniel Shaw, whose television career took off as part of Ed Murrow's fabled CBS News team in the 50s, recalled in a retirement speech decades later how, as a new boy, he'd sought advice from a CBS producer on how to come to grips with this new medium called television. "Tell me," said Shaw, "I can write a story all right, but what is the secret of success for a journalist in television? I mean, how do you do it on television to make it work?" And the producer said to Shaw, "The secret of success in television is sincerity. And if you can fake that, you've got it made." And these days you can add fake gravitas to the list. Watching sincerity being fake today would be amusing if it wasn't such a sad comment on the state of the industry. This is an age where The Daily Show in America, a nightly send-up of TV network news, rates higher where it counts than the real thing. What America's doing today in news programming, you can expect commercial TV in Australia, at least, and sometimes public broadcasting as well, to be doing tomorrow. But you would hesitate often to call it progress. When CBS, the network that gave us Murrow and Cronkite and a whole gallery, or Murrow and others and a whole gallery of quality journalists, launched a new breakfast program some years ago called The Early Show. It featured not 2, not 3, but 4 anchors. 1 patriarchal male with 3 women, and a 5th pseudo-anchor, the personality weatherman. And before the show was launched, the anchors spent a lot of quality time together, engaged in friendship training. On debut, each anchor had to present to the audience a touchy-feely profile of one or other of his or her fellow hosts, and then on a regular basis over ensuing weeks, spend quality time on air, bonding with the audience by sharing their inner feelings with each other in reaction to the topic of the day. Lots of sincerity, everything from the heart. Now, does that sound familiar? The New York Post TV critic said he'd describe the show as lifeless, but he wouldn't want to insult the dead. Politicians are no strangers to the art of projecting sincerity, and I'm sure often they mean it. But just to be sure they can project it on television, these days they're now media trained to within an inch of their lives. And that training includes the art of filling 10 minutes of an interview without necessarily answering a question. Fortunately, they haven't all mastered that one yet. I've made some of these observations previously, but the sentiment just becomes more and more relevant. This is the age of media management, of a veritable public relations army of image makers, spin doctors and lobbyists, and you can plot its evolution. Bob Menzies never had to worry about trimming his famous eyebrows or hiding his ample girth, but television came late in his political life. In '72, Gough went all fluffy around the hair as part of his pitch to television in Australia's first American-style election campaign, and the accident-prone Billy McMahon, his image beyond rescue, carried a rather crude mobile auto cue around the countryside, trying to make his speeches look authoritative, with disastrous results. Billy Snedden, as Liberal leader, carried cushions with him to raise his eye line for the camera. Obviously, no one explained to him that he could always ask for the camera to be lowered. Malcolm Fraser found the whole image thing far too undignified, and since he already looked down on journalists from a rather lofty height anyway, he didn't need cushions. By the 80s, John Howard was grooming his eyebrows, capping his teeth and using makeup for press conferences. Andrew Peacock specialised in hair tints, one of which, during a parliamentary sitting, turned out to be unexpectedly pink, much to his chagrin. The slimline, double-breasted Paul Keating carried his own makeup kit and shaver to reduce the 5 o'clock shadow for the impromptu doorstop. Bob Hawke didn't need advice on how to look the part. He'd been working on it all his life. Mark Latham in the image stakes seems to have tried his best to qualify as the Frankenstein's monster of Australian politics. And Kevin 07 played up the public persona of the vaguely likeable nerd who became Prime Minister. His party, of course, came to see him in a different light. I don't know whether you saw the YouTube segment where some wag had edited a few 7:30 Rudd interviews together, cut me out of it, and had Kevin Rudd interviewing himself. I don't know how he did it, but he didn't avoid a single question. Politicians have engaged in spin for as long as they've existed, but media management has never been more tightly controlled and the environment for journalists never more challenging. In Australia, I think it goes back to Gough. Menzies was happy just to occasionally invite his favourite journalists in for a good single malt whisky and slip them a story. Press secretaries were very rare birds indeed in those days, although the Prime Minister and opposition leader each had one. Professional lobbyists were just as rare. When Gough Whitlam came to power, every minister was allocated a press minder, but it had the opposite to the desired effect. Each minister was a law unto himself, and each press secretary seemed to take it as a personal challenge to outleak both his minister and his fellow press secretaries. So much so that as the damaging headlines grew in intensity, Gough read the Riot Act to his ministers in one famous cabinet meeting. telling them that any press secretary caught leaking from now on would be instantly sacked. And even before the Cabinet meeting had finished, the story had been leaked. 20 years on, the leaks in the Howard years were almost always carefully controlled and targeted. Rarely were they genuine scoops. The government media machine had a daily message. I was informed more than once that the Prime Minister wouldn't be available for interview on a particular current issue that I wanted to explore because it wasn't on message. If you wanted to know what the message was, you just had to listen for the Alan Jones interview on Sydney's 2GB, or Neil Mitchell on Melbourne's 3AW, or on breakfast television. Alexander Downer's press secretary once rather foolishly, I thought, let slip that they found Lateline quite useful for interviews to kickstart the next day's news cycle in the right direction. I imagined when I read that, in fact I could hear Tony Jones sharpening his scythe. And there's a whole process now for managing bad news. Some of you may remember what I think stands as the most blatant illustration of the exercise. The Blair government media advisor, I think in the Transport Department from memory, who put out an email to other officers on the morning of the September 11 attacks to the effect that, quote, "It's a very good day to get out anything we want to bury." In the Howard years, the practice developed that when a potentially damaging or politically sensitive report was due for release, the journalist would be summoned to the press conference and given the report to absorb as the press conference started. The highly embarrassing Palmer report into the scandal-ridden, obviously dysfunctional Immigration Department after the Cornelia Rao and Vivian Solon affairs was handled precisely in this way. The journalist filed into the conference room, and as the Minister Amanda Vanstone began to give her own version of Palmer's findings and the government's response, a trolley was wheeled in with copies of the 200-page report for journalists to read. So guess how well informed the questions were. There was a time this would never have been allowed to happen in that gallery. As for the public relations industry pioneered by Eric Bernays, its numbers also exploded in Canberra in the Whitlam years and have been growing ever since. In an Andrew Walley lecture a few years ago, the respected former newspaper editor, now independent publisher Eric Beecher, struck a chord with many working journalists when he talked about the remarkable rise of public relations as not only an influence, but almost as a kind of partner in the whole journalistic enterprise in this country. On the public relations industry, Beecher said, quote, "I'm certain the average media consumer has absolutely no inkling of the extent to which the stories they see, read or hear have been instigated, assisted or even managed by behind-the-scenes PR people whose only interest is to present their clients and their products in a positive light." He talked of a senior public relations figure who told him that the art of spinning had never been easier, that it was not unusual to see news releases drafted for a client in story form that appeared in the media virtually intact. Beecher said his PR informant was, quote, "like a fisherman talking about his catches in a well-stocked trout farm." It's not the existence of the public relations industry I have a problem with at all, or the justifiable corporate or government need for professional assistance in dealing with the media. It's the fact that the strength of that industry is now unhealthily disproportionate to the number of journalists dealing with it, and as PR numbers have exploded, journalist numbers have either remained static or diminished. Media organisations these days are producing more with less. Experience is less valued, newsrooms are getting markedly younger, simply because youth is cheaper to buy. There may be talent, energy and ambition in abundance, but not experience. There are fewer journalistic mentors carrying that invaluable bank of history in their memories, an appropriate degree of scepticism, an understanding of how the world works and the scars to go with it. Often the stories are more complex, the pitfalls are many, and journalists are swamped with an avalanche of spin. Even with the help of Google, proper scrutiny of our institutions, public and private, is undoubtedly more difficult. The respected British investigative journalist Nick Davies wrote a book about it in 2008 called Flat Earth News. He described the symptoms in an interview I had with him at the time on 7:30 in this way, quote, "At its heart, what's happened is that big corporations have taken over newspapers which used to be owned by small family firms, and they've injected the logic of commercialism into newsrooms, and that logic has overwhelmed the logic of journalism. The big structural sign of that is that all across the developed world, these new corporate owners of the newsrooms have cut editorial staff at the same time as they've increased the output of those staff. All those masses of extra supplements that newspapers now produce. And the result of that is, crudely put, and in the UK we did a big calculation on this, Your average Fleet Street reporter now has only 1/3 of the time to spend on each story that he or she used to have 20 years ago. If you take away time from reporters, you are taking away their most important working asset. So in this commercialised world where instead of being active gatherers of news, going out and finding stories and making contacts and doing funny old-fashioned things like checking facts, they've become instead passive processors of second-hand information. Stuff that comes up on the wires like Reuters or Associated Press, stuff that comes from the PR industry, an exact echo of the other side, on the other side of the world, of that other high-calibre journalist, Eric Beecher. Now, on the day I did that interview in Melbourne with Nick Davies, the story broke about sackings of journalists in Fairfax. And would you know that today, Crikey, this is the headline on Crikey, Fairfax slashes, quote, quality journalism with hundreds of fewer staff. The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald are preparing for a wave of industrial action after new Fairfax CEO Greg Hywood wielded the axe this morning, sacking over 100 production staff to achieve annual cost savings of $15 million under the cover of an announcement spruiking, quote, quality journalism, unquote. Now, as I speak, I can almost hear Fred Hilmer, as a former chief executive of the Fairfax Media Group, thinking, but the commercial realities of newsrooms in this age of new media, of convergence, of change, dictate that the bigger newsrooms of old media glory days are no longer sustainable. But the outcome, I'm saying, is a diminished journalistic output and damaged brands, and possibly ultimately self-defeating. Yes, journalism is in transition. The possibilities of new media technology and outlets are potentially exciting. But I don't think we can have any real idea at this stage of exactly what we are transitioning to. And beware the person in an age of such dramatic and ongoing and even accelerating change of the person who comes to you and with great certitude tells you what's going to happen next month or next year or in 10 years, because none of us really know. And I don't think there are any guarantees that the medium-term horizon, at least, is rosy for those who worship at the altar of consistent quality journalism. Nor should we lose sight of the fact that new media can easily be manipulated too, as I've already pointed out. Now, things happen in cycles. I'm not suggesting for a moment that quality journalism is going to be crushed forever, nor is it crushed now. It will live on. It will, at some point, have a resurgence in some form. We don't know what that form is. I'd rather not that we didn't all have to go through the pain, to be honest. I mean the pain of having to suffer so much infotainment as journalism. Strangely, in this age of remarkable computer technology and publishing, newspaper deadlines are less flexible than they were 20 years ago. And that's another area open to manipulation by governments on both sides of the political divide. Not that there's much divide left these days. Slip the bad news out late in the day, or more particularly, late on a Friday when newspaper deadlines are even less flexible before the bigger Saturday newspaper publications. And often those deadlines are less flexible for the day's breaking stories because of the greater effort going into production values and into the marketing side of the process. I haven't and won't even attempt to deconstruct the appalling doublespeak that is a feature of our times too, like never before, or unspeak, as British journalist and author Stephen Poole called it in an excellent book a few years ago. Nothing new in the practice, but these days we're knee-deep in it. Just read former Keating speechwriter Don Watson on the subject. Journalism worldwide has always faced enormous challenges, but rarely more than now. Producing news is not just another factory assembly line producing its own version of baked beans or widgets, but that's increasingly how our industry is seen by those who run it. Journalism, for me, on the one hand, is not getting too pompous about yourself as an individual player, but at the same time recognising the fundamental importance of our craft and what it represents in society. A vigorous, healthy media is at the core of democracy. Thomas Jefferson, one of America's founding fathers, actually regarded a free press as more important than the Parliament. Were it left to me, he said, to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate for a moment to prefer the latter. If that was true then, it's probably true now, in which case, heaven help us all. Ronald Reagan once observed that politics was often regarded as the world's second oldest profession. but that the more time he spent in it, the more elements it seemed to have in common with the oldest. Let me quote from the political scientist John Keane in his epic book, The Life and Death of Democracy. One of the unavoidable lessons to be learnt from the history of democracy is that when compared with the many different types of earthly regimes, democracy is utterly unique, exactly because it means minimally the self-government of equals, their freedom from bossing, violence, injustice, dogmas and metaphysical claims. It demands more than humans seem willing or are often capable of giving. Quote, during the darkest days of World War II, the Irish man of letters C.S. Lewis put his finger on the point. I am a Democrat, he wrote, because I believe in the fall of man. I think most people are Democrats for the opposite reason. A great deal of democratic enthusiasm descends from the ideas of people who believed in democracy because they thought mankind so wise and good that everybody deserved a share in the government. The danger in defending democracy on those grounds is that they're not true, Lewis added. The real reason for democracy is mankind is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. Aristotle said that some people were only fit to be slaves. I do not oppose him, but I reject slavery because I see no men fit to be masters. In the end, I'm not tonight going to answer my own question. Someone was suggesting we should take bets. Who's winning the race to the bottom? The answer to this will always be in the eye of the beholder. And I'm going to resist the cop-out of saying journalists and politicians are running neck and neck down the same slope. We have to hope and work towards the time when the race turns back towards another peak, and it will come. In the meantime, let's remain mindful of how we got here and how much further we can afford, or maybe not afford, to fall. At the same time, while people decry the media's excessive concentration on the personalities of politicians at the expense of policy debate, I firmly believe, as has occasionally happened in the past, that one well-centred, substantial politician with the capacity to articulate an inspirational vision and the determination to put at least partly into effect could change the landscape. And a landscape can be changed like that. I'm not attributing these attributes to Queensland's Premier Anna Bligh particularly, but look at how quickly sentiment in Queensland turned around overnight, from disapproval bordering on loathing to admiration, simply because she looked like a real, caring, unscripted and capable person in the way she handled the South East Queensland floods and then the North Queensland cyclone. She came across as real. Now, I don't want you to leave in a bleak frame of mind tonight, so I'm going to close, before taking questions if you have them, with my own favourite example of how so often beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Here now, unabridged, because I'm sure none of us would want any censorship on my part, are some entries from the comparative phone logs for the 7:30 report, as it was then, in the final weeks of the 2004 federal election campaign, after interviews on successive nights with the Prime Minister John Howard and Labor leader Mark Latham. This from a female viewer. Kerry O'Brien, you have just shown tonight who you are, and that is a bastard. I just think you're a Liberal voter and a Liberal pusher, and you can get fucked. Another female caller. Mr. O'Brien, I just wanted to know who the imposter was interviewing Mr. Latham. It wasn't the same person who interviewed Mr. Howard last night. It was a pussycat. I don't really expect more from the ABC, but I'm sick of it. Female again. I'm not even going to talk to Kerry O'Brien. He's nothing but a Liberal arse-licker. Male. I would like to say, Kerry O'Brien, that you are so biased towards Labor. Last night you just crucified Howard, and tonight you let Latham get away with murder. I am a dedicated Channel 2 watcher, and I will never watch you again. You biased prick. Male. You seem to hate Mark Latham with a vengeance. When you interview him, your face becomes twitchy. And it looks like you cannot stand the man. I think it may be because when you interview the Prime Minister, he just walks all over you. Female. I'd like to let you know that you were much nicer to the Labor leader. You were extremely vicious last night with the Prime Minister, and you were very tame with Latham tonight. Now, I imagine you get the drift, but I'll leave the last word to this anonymous male. I'm ringing to begin a political party of my own. It's called Get Rid of O'Brien. Thank you.